Thank you very much, and sorry for the slight delay, everyone, in starting the session. Unfortunately, we are all working from home, and a little bit of glitches unfortunately happen. Uh, Thank you very much for patiently waiting. We have close to 350 registrations, and at a time when real estate is not the is not booming as it did at one point in time, to have such great audience and attention is indeed very heartwarming. Thank you very much. I think just to quickly introduce the panel, I have with me Ritesh Vora. Ritesh is CEO of Investcorp. Historically, Ritesh has run successful funds in Saffron and then in IDFC, and one of the more um, successful real estate investors, so to say, because we generally, there's a perspective that a lot of people have burnt hands in real estate, but I think with Ritesh, we can proudly say that he's been one of the better ones at handling this asset class. Thank you very much, Ritesh. Um, we have Vipul from HDFC. Vipul has been extremely successful at managing residential uh, platforms and investments, and again, one of the more successful players. And we've had several interactions with Vipul also at the policy front, and he's very active on that count also in terms of developing the policy framework for investments in real estate. A very, very seasoned hand again. And lastly, I think, as I always, and this is, by the way, our second session in real estate investment platforms. And the first one that we did about last week was on commercial real estate investment platforms. This is on residential. We'll do another one very soon on industrials and warehousing. And like the previous one, there is only one permanent fixture other than NDA. People in this is Shobit. And Shobit is a very dear friend. I have dealt with him for 15 years on several mandates across. And whenever we've done a conference, Shobit has generally been there, and he's one of the sound hands at understanding real estate. So sorry, can people go on mute, please? Whoever. Yeah. And so that's the panel, and I think because it's Shobit, I think we will sort of jointly moderate this session, and we're going to keep it very interactive and easygoing. So maybe I'll just give a quick introduction, and maybe Shobit, I'll then give it to you to ask your commercial questions to Ritesh and Vipul. So I think, as I said last time, and I've discussed that, with Ritesh, with you several times, and being a little more conservative investor. There was a time when we used to look at real estate, and there were always the distribution waterfalls that we used to joke about. They used to go from 14 to 16% IRR, then 16 to 18, 18 to 20, 20 to 22, sometimes more than 24% IRR, and sometimes more than 28% IRR. And people used to wonder that real estate, there is, is just as valuable, probably more valuable than gold, and there can never be losses really, just cash flow mismatches wherever there were sometimes the projects did not return that much. And obviously, it was with that tremendous sentiment that a lot of LPs invested very bullishly. When 2005 Press Note 2 came in, and some of the foreign investors made money, some of them didn't. And I always say that those who made money went in quiet, and those who didn't make money always made more noise. Now, I don't know how far that is true, but I've definitely seen a lot of people make good money in this and just try to remain under the radar. So it's always been a great asset class. But I think, as we've seen, uh, it really boiled down to sort of the three P's, partner, property, and pricing. And partner sort of taking the most primitive role in the relationship. And I think so long as your partner was right, your investment strategy was right, your geographical locations were right, I think people generally made money, and it was a successful strategy. And I think that probably laid the pathway to investment platforms. Investment platforms happen not just with developers. Investment platforms happen between LP-GPs. Large LPs partnered with GPs, and I don't think it's, and I think it's pretty common that real estate is no longer a blind pool market. It's really managed accounts, and therefore most of these managed accounts could be loosely called as platforms. And then I think it progressed to partnering with reputed developers across across well-designed and defined strategies, and I think it became very successful. I think, Ritesh, you have successfully managed some great offshore capital. Uh, Vipul has again done a very successful platform with certain developers. But I think where this has somehow, we have felt, at least in my personal experience, I felt the foreign investors lacking or not having the adequate avenues to invest in real estate in a way, or sort of face that kind of challenge, was because real estate started from equity, turned to debt, structured debt, then pure debt, then sort of structured equity, and again equity. So the cycle kind of continued. But foreign investors who did not have an onshore presence sort of faced challenges that India sort of had a flip-flop approach in some of these investments. Foreign portfolio investments in debt were allowed, then they were not allowed, then there was a 3-year lock-in, then we brought about the VRR route, which said, oh, there is no 3-year lock-in, but still you can take out up to about 25% of the money, and you can actually take out 75%, but you cannot repatriate it. So all those kind of complications kept coming up, and I think that flip flop sort of complicated the lives of a lot of foreign investors. And I think as a result, a lot of these investors felt that it's important to have an onshore entity rather than do this directly offshore, because that will be safer. And if you have to really invest in a sustained basis in Indian real estate, you rather have a place of business or have a vehicle in India. That vehicle could be an AIF, could be an NBFC, and each one has its own advantages. We're going to discuss, I think, each of those. Ritesh has already successfully set up an NBFC with foreign capital, has its own avenues. The AIF strategy has equally been successful. And I think a third strategy, which I'm seeing emerge now, is a very successful credit secondary strategy, where uh, all the real estate debt, which is currently not in distress yet, it is still not NPA, but it is still sort of stressed in that sense. The creditors are selling that debt $60, 60 cents or 70 cents to a dollar, which is being securitized into a securitization trust. And a lot of foreign investors that we know are very keenly looking at some of those kind of strategies. So there are emerging strategies coming up. Some people believe it should not be credit secondaries. This refinance business, Hindi mein kehte hain, iski topi uske sar, is not a great idea. So rather the money goes in primary. Some people feel that that's the 70 cents to a dollar is a great bargain. So I think there are different strategies. We're going to discuss each of them. I don't want to take too much time. Shobit, maybe I'll quickly pass on to you for you to ask questions, give your commercial acumen, and lead this.
Thank you, Ruchir, for the kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to be on your seminars and webinars now. Um, I would like to thank Nishit Desai and all our participants for taking out time to being on this sort of session. I have to really this is a real special session for me. I've got Vipul and Ritesh. Ritesh and I started work in 2005 from the same office. We shared the same office 15 years ago, and likewise with Vipul. They were both very early investors, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. And it's very strange how paths cross way. When Vipul started, and Vipul, you can sort of add if you like, for the first 10 years from 2005 to end of 2014, right, about $7 billion of equity capital came in. Most of it went towards offices. So 3.5 went into office, 2.5 went into resi. But Vipul, at that point, I thought you invested more on the credit side. And in the same time, Ritesh took up only equity investments project by project. 2015 to 2020, we saw about $14 billion. Somewhere Resi got completely left out. So out of $14 billion, only $2 billion went into Resi. Balance 12 billions were all offices. So it was Blackstone, Brookfield, just buying standing assets, right? And in that phase, I think Ritesh, you went more on the credit side of Resi, whereas Vipul, you went completely on equity side. So before I just sort of come to this balance between debt and equity and credit and equity, in the second phase of RE investments, 5 or 6 platforms got set up. There was APG that set up a platform with Godrej. There was Actis and others that set it up with Shapur. There was Warburg and Goldman that set up an ongoing platform with Piramal Reality. Ivanhoe announced a platform with Piramal Finance, but did not really invest, I think, except one deal. So they've not done too much investments. And of course, Vipul, you announced 2 platforms, one with actually 3, ATS, Prestige, and Tribeca. So really, I'm going to just throw the ball at you saying, what were you thinking? And what's the investment thesis of along this? And second question I also want you to sort of talk about is why equity kept dropping and credit kept increasing from 2015, whereas the need of the hour was that it required more equity than debt. So today we are standing and facing this special situation or credit dislocation on residential. Over to you, Vipul, to try and see whether you can answer these.
So you're asking some 7, 8 things simultaneously, but I'll try and take it step by step. So first of all, why equity? Why not debt, or why equity is going down? But just before that, let me just correct. But since 2015, out of almost $1 billion that we have invested, about 2/3 of it is debt and structured credit, and about 1/3 is equity.
Okay.
But coming to your point, it's very simple. Let me give a pretty favorite example of mine. So let's assume we are all so-called sophisticated real estate experts, stroke investors with all kinds of understanding and analysis and blah blah blah. And then there is a friend who also said, "Listen, he's a poor engineer." He said, "Listen, I also love real estate, so I will also do real estate along with you guys. You guys are the experts, but I'll try and see whatever head and tail I can make of." So, and let's assume these two people invest every 10 years. Okay. So in 2005, if the real estate sophisticated industry and the so-called layman was investing in real estate, the real estate industry was investing in what? In public equity. So you do some kind of QIP, go and take stake on the public platform. You do private equity. A lot of developers are selling stakes at an asset level, like DLF did with the Merrill and so on and so forth. A lot of people did. You can do so-called mezzanine financing, which is what bulk of the fund industry is, and you can do senior secured debt, what a bank would do. And this so-called uninformed guy will say, "Listen, I don't know anything. I'll follow 2 strategies. One is how I would generally do my projects in school level. So I will just go and buy a flat or buy 100 flats in a project that is equity funded by any of the funds. Or second is even better, he said, I will go and buy a plot of land adjoining the project that has been funded in any of those 4 formats by any of the sophisticated investors." And now, if you take progressively, I said 10 years, but if you take progressively, even every 5 years, all the 4 investments, if I'm a public equity investor in real estate in 2004, 2009, 2014, and I don't know about 19, but in these three, I would be sitting on 1/3 to 1/10 as far as my return is concerned of my principal. If I'm private equity, I would be sitting on maybe 1/3 to zero. Okay, I know so many of the funds who have just written off their entire thing. If I'm a mezzanine fund, it depends on how big I am and how persistent I am as far as my things are concerned. But the average return has been in maybe average return of the industry. You would be a better guess, but it's about 10 to 11% as far as we are concerned. If I'm a senior secured debt, then depending on whether I'm a private sector lender or a private public sector lender, or I'm a small NBFC, large NBFC, I have kind of made my money. But the funny part is that the so-called layman investor if he had invested in any flat in 2004 or 2009, I will not say that for 2015, but 2004, 9, and maybe up to till 12, he would be sitting on 2x, or he or she would be sitting on 2x to 5x on that particular asset in terms of value. If But the best part is the highest return is the second investment, that if he had gone ahead and bought a plot, like if he's a HNI and gone ahead and bought a 2-acre parcel of land next to any of the mill lands that are lying in Bombay or any of the other projects that have been funded, that plot has also given them particularly a great return, significantly more than what the investments have got. So to cut the long story short, there are two kinds of investments which are being done. One is which is a direct asset investment, and one is all the derivatives of funding the supplier. And why is there a negative correlation? We are one of the very, very, very few industries, or probably the only industry where there is a negative correlation between the prices of the end product and the fortunes of the supplier. And this is happening only and only because there is leakage in the ecosystem. There's a corporate governance issue. If the price of cement bag goes up, then the fortunes of the cement manufacturer has to go up. If the price of a Maruti car goes up, then the share price of a Maruti car on an average ceteris paribus has to go up, or the car manufacturer has to go up. But we have seen situations where the price of an average flat in Lower Parel has gone up. I remember in 2005 it used to be 4,000 rupees to probably 40,000 rupees. But look at what has happened to all the people who are manufacturing those homes. Now, not to belabor the point, but I think there is as an investor, we are taking two risks. We are taking a counterparty risk. Ruchi talked about three P's. There's a counterparty risk, obviously, of the particular developer, and there is everything else, which is real estate risk. You can put pricing, property, location, blah blah, everything. I think in the Indian real estate context, the real estate risk has done very well. Anybody who has on an average on a long term basis invested in real estate, there will always be some examples which are not completed and some legal problems and so on and so forth. But even residential, if I have on an average bought something over a 10-year rolling basis, it is not that I'm losing money or I'm not getting even it is an inflation protected investment at the least. But if I've invested on the supply side, I have on an average not done well. The primary difference is corporate governance, and which is the reason why when the so-called irrational equity came in 2000, I've been in the industry now for as when the first fund was set up. When the irrational so-called equity came in 2006 to 2008 period, a lot of it got lost not because the real estate pricing risk was not good or real estate did not do well. It is a lot of it had to do with obviously the leakage. Yes, some deals were also overpriced quite irrationally, but so and that is primarily the reason why equity has gone down, because equity did not returns. So the natural thing was, let's give debt. Cost of debt went down post 2008. Cost of money went down. Everybody was searching for yields. So a lot of credit stuff came in. Your second thing, so we started this. So like I'm part of this. Like I think the fifth job I'm doing in HDFC in the last 14 years. But in this role, we always felt for last 3.5 years, 4 years back, that there is a huge play in so-called mid-income housing and low-cost housing. I know it's more fashionable to talk about it today, but 4 years back, it was always a loss-making proposition. Because 4 years back also, when anybody tried their hands in 2008 to 2009 period, they burnt themselves. Whether it was Tata Housing in their Boisar project, or it was DLF in Manesar, or it was Puravankara in under Provident at that point of time, or I can give a number of examples, or even Jerry to that extent under his entire portfolio. They did not do probably as well as what they anticipated it to do. And primary reason was land and approvals and blah blah. Everybody has a different story, and we felt that a lot of it had to do with developer approval capability, ability to do raise this money, put it together. We think that it's not about debt or equity, it's about probably doing holistic financing. That is what we try to do. So it's not equity or debt. We've tried to partner with so-called grade A. That definition also keeps changing. Partner with grade A, but to my investors, I keep saying we are partnered with grade A developers. So grade A developers do equity where it's required. You can't always give only equity. You have to leverage that investment. So we gave MES. In some cases, we even give senior secured financing for construction into our same project. So I think time is gone when it is about doing only one strategy. It has to be about you, and especially in the last couple of years, not and COVID will only complicate life further, but it's all about whether you can do a complete financial closure on the project or not, and that's what we've been trying to do.
Thank you, Vipul. So I'll just sort of summarize saying two, three things. One, I took away was that from 2014, the price of residential hasn't been appreciating as much. So a lot of the secondary markets that you talked about has kind of fallen off. So ordinary investors have stayed away from that market, right? Second, you're saying is the time now is come where you have to provide solution capital to residential, and a simple straight strategy may not really work, right? Saying do pure equity everywhere and that works. You may have to do pure equity, you may have to do construction funding, and if required even do senior secured, super senior type of model. Ritesh, you've done both equity as well as debt on residential. Primarily I think you've stayed away from offices. So what's your experience been? And I believe you're also sort of in the middle of the fundraise right now. So what are you
He's doing
hearing
an
from?
he's
What are
doing an
you
office fundraise. He's doing an office fundraise as well, core asset.
after
So
after 15 years of doing Resi? So what's the
correct.
motivation, and what are you hearing about? What are you hearing from the investors?
Sure. Thanks, Shobit and Richard. So yeah, I think, Shobit, to your question of what we've been doing for the last 15 years, if you look at it in hindsight, 2005 to 2008, it does feel like that the policy framework that we had at that time for foreign investments in Indian real estate was actually in a way designed for failure. I'm not taking away, the responsibility of investors, fund managers, developers, everyone else. But the fact that in a very, very immature industry, we only wanted pure equity, only in greenfield projects, right from land acquisition stage, only in very large format projects, etc., etc. If you look at it in hindsight, it just feels like that, would have made money in that kind of a construct. Of course, some people did and many people didn't. And from our investments from that time as well, we have a mixed bag of a portfolio in terms of what worked and what didn't work. I think fundamentally, I keep saying this to all investors, that I think one big difference between the times that were then versus the times that are today is that at that time we were all focused only on returns. So what is it looking like on Excel, and a million square foot project will get fully built, approved, sold, completed in 3 years time, and my IRR is going to be 37%. And we didn't really pay much attention to risks, because frankly a lot of us were doing this for the first time, including the developers in most cases. I think today the focus is far more on risks and managing those risks, and which is why I think this current phase of real estate investing in India, I would say over the last few years, has been relatively more successful. And I think that straddles across asset classes, across the capital stack, whether it was equity, whether it was structured equity, whether people buying completed buildings or providing financing in the form of mezzanine or senior secured. I think in general, there is a far greater appreciation of risk, and people have put in place the structures and the mechanisms to take care of those risks. Of course, mishaps will still happen, and like in any other industry at any investing sort of vintage. But I think by and large, the focus on risks is far greater now. In terms of what we're looking to do now, of course, we've been working on the credit side for the last many years. even though we were operating in a fund format at IDFC and now at InvestCorp, the focus has always been on senior secured, because I just feel that, just investing into real estate, lending to real estate, especially from a fund where you're targeting relatively higher IRRs, that itself is a risky strategy. And then to add on to that, a structured risk by going into mezzanine financing or, subordinate financing, et cetera, is just adding, more risk to the whole overall equation. And, that's why we've sort of stayed away from that. By and large, that's worked out okay for us so far. Only time will tell how, post-COVID, the portfolio will shape up. But I would say by and large, it's been okay. So what we're looking to do right now is to keep sort of growing the credit franchise. This time we are doing it in an NBFC format. And the reason for NBFC format, while NBFCs are actually going out of fashion, is because we just feel that it allows us at some point in the future, may not be today, at some point in the future to add leverage, create some benefits of scale and synergy, and also allow us to actually lend to better quality developers at relatively lower yields. Again, the whole focus is on managing risk. If you're building a longer term platform, then that's the sort of strategy that we are more comfortable with. And an NBFC platform allows us to sort of pursue that strategy. And along with this, we've also had our investors come to us, especially now with InvestCorp's franchise globally, saying that we would also want to look at asset acquisition opportunities in India, which is what InvestCorp has been doing globally for the past 40 years. So within that, we've been looking at various asset classes, offices being one. Again, in the COVID era, I think, offices are getting a little uncertain, at least in the short term. We don't know how the whole asset class is going to hold up, at least over the next few quarters, and what the impact of this work from home is going to be. I think some of those are unknowns right now. But then, there are other asset classes which are maybe net beneficiaries of COVID, whether it's warehousing, whether it's some of the other asset classes. So we're evaluating all of those and putting together the structure in place as well to sort of pursue those investments as well.
Maybe I think,
yeah, come in, please, Ruchir, over to you.
Yeah, no, I think I had a question maybe both to Ritesh and to Vipul. I think when we talk about these strategies, and Shobhit, you talked about Godrej platform and the Goldman Warburg Piramal platform. Both of us, both of them were sort of done by us. Godrej was a very interesting story where Godrej was really just a service provider and a shareholder. Goldman Piramal was a very, very different story where we really betted on the construction company, the construction ability. It was not self-liquidating. It was not yield-generating assets. It was really the construction company's IPO. That was the exit strategy. So it was a very, very different. I don't know. So I think Vipul and Ritesh, I think question to you is: do you see such kind of developers, on whom you can? So I think, is the real estate market ripe today to say in terms of residential that there can be a construction arm, there can be an asset ownership arm, and the and the management arm and the construction arm can really be taken public, etc. So because for residential, is there an IPO story at some stage beyond just self-liquidation? That's the first question. And do you feel that there are developers that merit that kind of quality? And I think the second is that I think the market is flooded today with opportunities because there are a lot of developers who had good projects but could not sort of manage them. And the larger developers with capital from you guys are having enough opportunities to buy such projects so in distress. And at one point in time, this model was great. People earned great money out of DM fees. And the moment a great developer's brand name came up, funding became very easy. And relationships were obviously there with you people. So I think two questions. One is, I think both, two questions and both of them sort of converge into one concept. The pedigree of developers. How are you looking? How big is that pedigree of developers on whom you can bet your money? And where do you see them growing with this? Is it always going to be a self-liquidating model, or is it going to grow somewhere to a construction company IPO kind of a thing like you bet it on Piramal?
So, okay. So, no, I personally believe that there is a great story in an entity, if that is what you mean, and not only the asset. Like, for example, Shobit talked about two platforms. Actually, we have set up seven. We have set up with ATS here. We have set up with, we have taken 49% stake in Mahindra Happiness. We have a platform with Rustomji. In South, we have with Prestige. In Ahmedabad, we have with Arvind Group. And in Calcutta, we just closing. So the idea is that there will always be, see, residential is 75-80% of the market. And there will always be a demand provided the supply is of quality, is coming at the right time and at the right price. Um, that is happening now because of the structural problems that the entire economy and the real estate ecosystem was facing over the last 2 to 3 and 2.5 years. So there is a great story, in my opinion, about quality developers doing low and mid-income projects. If they are able to do it, and then it can be what can be termed as closest to manufacturing, because sales will not be a problem. We have, just to give an example, in the month of April, Maruti they said that they have not sold a single car. In the month of April, we have across 9 projects of ours booked something like 600 apartments. Now, the key thing here is that any of our projects where the apartments are more than 65 lakhs, zero sales. In fact, negative sales in some of them because cancellations are happening. But wherever we have projects between 30 to 50 lakhs by a reputed developer, sales are happening. So a 50 lakh rupee apartment is becoming more essential than probably a 5 to 6 lakh rupee car or a 2 lakh rupee holiday. And because of the psychological advantage that a house brings, this entire thing about millennials and rental and 1% rental, and I'm not having a single place of work, I may be moving by, log on to a single house and a big mortgage, all those things, at least the emotional aspect of that will become more. And I think that people may not go for the big ones, but they will definitely say, I need to have one home.
I think one question I'm going to take from Amit Diwan, our friend Amit, he's
Yeah.
on. I think he's very keenly saying that we should actually stick to the questions that we had given in the webinar invite, and we should discuss them. I think that's a good comment. We'll do that. And I think one question is, especially from Amit, is that what are the approvals that I think Ritesh and Vipul, you guys look at before you consider investing in developmental assets? And I think the second question is, how are you seeing the challenges in financial closure? Maybe I want both Vipul and Ritesh your comments. Maybe Vipul, you can go first. Oh, yeah, maybe Ritesh.
Sure. So I think I think the amount of approvals or the type of approvals uh, any investor is looking for before parting with their money. I think obviously it all depends on people's strategies, right? I mean, if you are in a developmental play where it's a longer term equity kind of an investment that you're making, perhaps an investor will be comfortable taking maybe a fair bit of the building plan approvals. Maybe a lot of people will not be comfortable in change of land use or some of those kind of approvals. If you look at someone like us who's looking at providing senior secured loans from an NBFC to be set up, we are actually looking at all approvals in place. We don't want to take any risk on approvals because the kind of returns we are seeking do not merit us taking that kind of a risk. I think that's really my short answer on this.
You're more conservative. Vipul, what kind of approval risk? How early will you come in?
We come in at land acquisition stage, but we will not take zoning risk. I will not take, and I cannot also to some extent invest in a agricultural land and then say, okay, fine, I'll wait for some kind of zoning to happen. But if it is zoned, building plan, all those we come at the land buying stage.
Got it. Got it. And what about financial closure? How difficult are you seeing financial closure happen? And that was my question when we were discussing before. That to what extent, let's say, obviously, developer will promise you financial closure will happen. It doesn't happen. To what extent are you gonna, support him in that process? Are you supporting them? And are you seeing financial closure challenges happen?
we don't fund a project if the financial closure is not there, even at the land buying stage.
Okay, got it. And Ritesh, same with you, right? So
Yeah, no, so I think it all depends on what stage we're coming in at. Typically, in a residential project, there is obviously a great reliance, which has been steadily coming down over the last many years on customer receivables to achieve financial closure. To my mind, there aren't too many projects which have been fully funded with equity and debt, to achieve 100% financial closure before they actually launch construction. Or most people at least do take a fair bit of reliance on customer sales. But if it was said, let's say 7-8 years ago, that this is a negative working capital game, and you put some money and get it started, and then there are so much sales that happen that you can actually take out your working capital and start doing some other project. Obviously, that whole story has turned on its head in the last few years, given that we are now in the seventh year, I would say, of the residential slowdown. So I think what we are looking to do is actually take on a finite development cost exposure. So, for example, if the project is 5 towers and each tower is 200,000 square foot, in good times, people will launch maybe 3 towers in one go and then 2 towers in another go. Today, I think what you would end up doing, Ruchir, is maybe just launch one tower, make sure that you are reasonably okay in terms of the cost of that tower. And then once you achieve, let's say 70% sales in that tower, then you move on to the next tower. So I think people are sort of this. Obviously, there is a financial closure risk given slow sales, but I think you just need to manage it on a project to project basis.
Ritesh, and Vipul, I think what you're saying is that, look, different pools of capital have different appetite. So right from land stage to late stage projects, but you're saying one thing for sure, that all the money that you are now sort of giving to developers is really primary. That means it's going into cement, concrete, steel, and there is literally no takeout. Given the experience of the last 15 years, where all kinds of cute structures were done, and then suddenly we were staring at financial closure not being achieved. I think, Ruchir, to answer your question, I think that's the kind of discipline that's coming in on the residential side. And I'll bring in at this point, I'd like to bring in Abhinav. Abhinav, you've helped a lot of people structure these platforms. What are some of the corporate governance issues? And I think Vipul touched upon it at the very start, saying there's lots of leakages, and therefore that's been bad experience for investors. How are these getting plugged, and how's RERA helping in all of this?
So I think what I'll start off by saying is that Ruchir and Shobit, you guys were involved in the first transaction when I did it over half a dozen years ago. And what you told me was that in real estate, you are never betting on a project, you're betting on the developer or the promoter. And I think this is something that Vipul was also referring to earlier. Uh, I think on the platform side, we end up facing a lot of issues, and I'm cognizant of the time, and I won't take too long on this. I think some of the bigger things that we've seen becoming a challenge and becoming heavily contested or debated is, the choice of projects. The developer who you're partnering with. How do you ensure that the developer does not act in a manner that the good projects or the ideal projects are coming to the platform? So that's always a big point of discussion, whether you want an exclusivity, whether you want a non-compete from the developer, whether you want the right of first refusal for any project the developer is considering. I think that's something that's becoming quite important, and that is one of the most heavily, debated or negotiated aspects in the course of the transaction. The other one, of course, is a deadlock mechanism. While you have betted with the promoter, you are in, so to say, bet with the promoter for a number of projects, but a simple deadlock on a single portfolio, for example, cannot have a bearing on the entire transaction platform. Similarly, when you have a platform-wide issue, or an issue which goes to the root of the entire relationship, that needs to percolate to each of the individual assets as well. So the deadlock mechanism on what is a deadlock mechanism at a platform level and what is a deadlock at a project level is something that needs to be looked at very carefully and needs to be structured in a manner that there is no seepage of one sort of a deadlock to the other. and what are the implications of the deadlock more important? If it's a platform level of a deadlock, for example, there's a particular situation where you have a disagreement on the pricing for an overall structure as a whole rather than just one portfolio, then how do you do that? An example would be a project management or development fees that the developer is asking for. That's one. The other is, of course, the transfer of interest component for both the investor and the promoter. As an investor, you want the promoter to be locked in for till the projects are completed and sold. As investors, and this becomes more pertinent when you have multiplicity of investors, like some of the platforms that we were referring to earlier, like the JPG one, where there were multiple investors. This became more pertinent to make sure that no one investor can transfer their entire interest and get out of the platform or a project, so to say, without following a mechanism. And that mechanism generally would be to get the other investors to buy in those portfolios, to buy in those interests. And I think the fourth one, which is very critical, is the role of the developer, who is also a promoter shareholder and who's also the development manager, the project manager, as we were calling him, and distinguishing the roles between that of a developer and that of a particular promoter, because the lines there get blurred very often, where we tend to forget that the developer is acting in a professional capacity when providing the developmental capabilities along with being a shareholder. So the entire governance mechanism has to be separate. It's like when you're doing a investment into a company, you're looking at the promoter from the perspective of being a promoter as well as an employee, say a managing director. So those roles need to be kept separate, and there needs to be demarcation of how both of them will play out. And these have different implications on how they play out in the RERA as well, which we can get to. But I think these are the biggest issues that we've seen from a governance perspective in the platforms that we've worked on.
Maybe Abhinav, we'll just pick up on the RERA issues as well, but just before that, I think because I think a lot of questions coming in, and they are actually aligned with what we mentioned in our in the sort of flow of the agenda. I think purely from a before I pick your brains on RERA issues, I think clearly one question was that the different kind of emerging platforms structures that we are seeing. So clearly, I think we started off with in Godrej Energy, started off with just being a DM fees and a shareholder. And I think what we've seen later on emerging is that the great quality of developers end up becoming fund managers. So while they do end up earning the fees of a development manager, in their role as fund managers, they also earn the 220, the carried interest, and the management fees, pooling in funds from large foreign investors as well. And in their capacity as a fund manager, they are at an arm's length with their affiliate, which is acting as the development manager. And I think it's the best of all worlds and probably the next level of progression for great quality developers, having the support of large A-grade investors like this. I think the question for you is, and obviously now AIFs have also come in early. There was a big challenge that when you had to set up an offshore entity, there was RBI approval required and all that. When we did this early on, you did not have the regime for foreign investments into AIF that liberalized. Now it is rather simple. There, in many cases, foreign investors still choose to come into a pool vehicle and not directly into an AIF because they may have to file returns, etc. in India, and that's not very convenient for them. But having said that, and I think the pool is really expanding. From a residential real estate perspective, what are the big ticket RERA issues that because that's the area that some of these investors are very concerned about. Maybe you could just highlight them very quickly, and then we can go back to.
Yeah, and I'll just take a second on the point that you were mentioning. You're right. The AIF is becoming a preferred structure now, and wherever we've seen investors wanting to pool offshore, we've looked at unified structures as well, where the pooling happens offshore with a single AIF investor, and we use that structure. So that also, as we were discussing, is becoming quite common now. On the RERA side, I think you're right. It is it's an evolving law. As we all know, it's not a extremely old law. It's a recent introduced law. And there are a lot of aspects there that are growing and evolving by the day. I think one of the most important things that investors especially need to do is to ensure that the entire role of the development and of the project is set out to be the responsibility of the promoter. And this should be done in as many equivocal manner as you can put it out there. It needs to be stated that the requirement for getting the approvals, the requirement for even smaller aspects like ensuring the project is insured, everything lies on the promoter or the developer at the end of the day. And this is to insulate the investor from a risk of being considered as a promoter. The other thing is that even smaller aspects which earlier we never used to worry about. For example, in a SPV where the project is being developed, we earlier used to have clauses to state that the SPV will not have any employees and the developer will deploy adequate resources for the development of the project. I think we've seen investors and developers being even wary of those clauses, because at the end of the day, what these platforms are working on is calling the SPV, which is developing the project, the promoter itself, rather than the actual development entity, which may be one of the bigger developers, as you were mentioning, to be the promoter. So with that in mind, saying that you don't have adequate resources, but it's all going to be run by a third party, calling it a promoter is becoming a little difficult. Another thing that we've seen investors tend to prefer is control over the decision-making process through committees at the board level, rather than sitting at the with a majority at the board. Have committees which, like project management committees, etc., which give binding advice to the company's board at times, which have to be followed. So these are some of the aspects that we've seen from an investor perspective to ensure that they don't get categorized in the bucket of promoter. Of course, the issue becomes a little more nuanced when you have to change a promoter, because that requires approval of the authority, of the RERA authority, along with 2/3 of the unit holders. There have been relaxations last year for security enforcement, but in situations like this, when you're not purely a lender but a partner with equity infusion as well, this becomes difficult. And the aspect that I was mentioning about the promoter being the developer has also been, a little mired in controversy since this circular that came in last year, which said that for security enforcement, you can enforce the security without the approval of RERA authority, because that implies that the promoter is the person who's holding the shares, even though the person registered as the promoter is actually the SPV. So, I mean, as I said, this is a new law. There hasn't been a landmark judgment on it by the Supreme Court or the higher courts to say this is how the law will apply. So it's all how we play it out, and how it actually finally plays out in some landmark judgment. We'll have to wait and watch for that, I guess.
Thank you. Vipul, you're doing these platforms. You said 7 of them. How you dealing with some of these, call it RERA issues, especially in case where underwriting goes not per plan, right? And you have to change developer, how easy or difficult it is. Have you had any examples?
Frankly, we have
like
not yet. We have not yet reached a stage. See, all the projects that we've done under equity platforms are greenfield projects. So we have not yet reached a stage in any of them where we are going off the RERA grid, to say the least.
Sorry.
Your connection is weak.
Case. Can you hear me?
Vipul, you may have to repeat. Vipul, you may have to repeat when the signal.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. No, what I was saying is that in most of the cases, so we have done in all these platforms, we have all these are greenfield projects, and we have not yet reached a stage in any of them that we reach a RERA problem. So we have not yet faced that, but a large part of it comes about active involvement. Active involvement, active asset monitoring. Some of the points that Abhinav mentioned are very relevant. And these things will pan out depending on the comfort level and what kind of board rights that you're keeping and how actively you are managing things at the ground level. Because I think I'll be wrong if I say that you can predict in your Excel modeling everything that can possibly go wrong. A lot of it depends, because you're an equity partner, you are effectively going through the ups and downs together. The key thing is having skin in the game as far as the partner is concerned. I think the projects where Ruchir talked about the fund manager and the development manager being the same entity, there is a clear conflict of interest. So, it will create more complications than a case where there is significant skin in the game as far as a partner is concerned. I think that becomes the single biggest factor for us in terms of ability to keep any of these partners.
Vipul,
Maybe one
just to
question.
continue,
Yeah.
sorry. When you say you do investment platforms, I mean, we don't need to know exactly, but directionally, what is the economics? So do you go in 70-30 and then do distribution based on IRRs, like a promote towards the developer? I mean, the platform that we were talking about had a 3-tier promote at 16 IRR, at 20 IRR, at 22 IRRs, right? And over and above that, there was a development management fee, which was between 6 and 8% of construction cost. Are you using the similar format, or have you done something different?
So we have two formats. In about four of them, we have the same format as you are pointing out. In three of them, we have a plain vanilla format where we are just getting into the entity itself. Like with Mahindra's, we are a shareholder of the parent company, which is the Happiness, and all the costs are in that company. So there is no separate fee which is being paid to the thing. The entity itself is having the cost,
Yeah,
and
so
we sit
that
at the
that
bottom and
so
manage it.
that's the entity level investment. So that's slightly different. Yes, that's right. Sorry, Ruchir, over to you. You were
Yeah,
asking something. Yeah.
yeah, no, I'm just trying to take some of the critical questions which are aligned with our petition. I think this is for Ritesh, because, and I think these are questions from Allstate and Heinz and others. Uh, which asset class would you choose to invest in? And Ritesh, I think this is more suited for you because you're raising a core asset fund, you have an NBFC, you historically done a lot of RESI. What is your favorite pick? RESI, office, warehousing, data centers?
You know,
You cannot generalize. It's a difficult question.
so it's a pointed question. So in the current environment, I would say my ideal investment pick is investing in a bunch of existing data centers. But I don't know whether such an investment opportunity in a ready format exists.
Right.
Within India at the moment. Other than that, I think warehousing is expected to have some positive benefits, with greater e-commerce and so on and so forth. Maybe that's another sort of asset class that is making sense. Commercial or offices, like I said earlier, I think there is a short-term dissonance at the moment, given the work from home and how this is going to pan out over the next 1-2 years. I think we would sort of hold ourselves before sort of going in over there. And Resi, we've done it in the past. We continue to do it going forward as well. I think we will just need some time, let's say, a few months, maybe 3 to 6 months, for some amount of, the current turbulence to settle down, so that one can actually, one is in a position to actually underwrite something. I mean, today, I'm not able to underwrite as to whether a project will get sold in 2 years or 3 years. Labor has gone away. When are they coming back? When will construction restart? So there are some of these questions which will take some time to get answered. I don't know whether there is going to be a second wave of COVID or a third wave, or when will the first wave get over. I think those are things which are going to impact any investment strategy that not just real estate,
Yeah.
but anything else that you might be doing as well.
Maybe one more quick question for you on the same count. We're running short on time. Sorry to. I think one of the agendas that we wanted to discuss was also emerging yield generating residential assets, the student living, the senior living, the co-living, the timeshares. I think that's a question from Ajay Ruia from Allstate, and I think a couple of other people here. I know a lot of people here asking. So, do you see enough opportunity there? And would you be willing to take a bet on them?
No, so we are looking at some of these. I think co-living is the sort of Indian version of multifamily as you see it in the US. Regular residential yields we all know are 2.5% and thereabouts in India. To be able to build to suit custom design buildings with amenities and Wi-Fi and all sorts of things put in, you are able to enhance your yield to a relatively respectable level, I would say. I'm not sure if there is enough depth in that market right now. It's an emerging asset class. I can say that from Investcorp private equity side, we are investors in the largest co-living company in the country, which gives us a close sort of view of how this, OpCo as well as the PropCo side is sort of emerging. I think it's definitely interesting, Ruchir. And we are looking at a few assets as well in that space. But again, it's going through the same turbulence, right? If people are going to be working from home, how many of them are going to come into Bangalore and how many of them are going to come into to Bombay or Delhi, or would they rather be working from wherever tier 2 or tier 3 city that they are from? So again, some turbulence there right now, but it's certainly something which is interesting. Student housing again is an interesting area. Some legal issues around how you segregate the assets from trusts and so on and so forth. So again, I don't see like massive deal volumes in these spaces, but definitely on the periphery, I think these are interesting asset classes that are emerging.
And I think on ground up commercial, because there has obviously been tremendous interest from large institutional investors on core assets and stabilized yields and returns. And I think that's obviously been an obviously monetization through, REITs and all that. But ground up commercial, do you think it's because I think a lot of those assets were bought by the Blackstones of the world, and there was a massive challenge in terms of supply. Do you think ground up commercial is really the way to go? Do you think that, that's a hot asset class to invest in?
See, again,
Especially now when TCS has announced that they'll work with 25% of their workforce, and many people really following it.
Correct. So I think ground up commercial, Ruchir, was a natural progression because people wanted to buy only yielding assets with the grade A tenants that India offers. As in, when those stock of those assets started to sort of dwindle because a lot of assets were acquired by people. I think the next step was get into forward contracts or build to suit and ground up construction and so on and so forth. So I think it's a natural progression. People are going sort of deeper and deeper into the commercial side that way. Again, I think right now may not be the best time. I guess next few months at least, maybe 2-3 quarters, till the time the commercial office situation becomes a little bit clearer in terms of what the impact of work from home is going to be in the longer term. And I think then you might see more investments coming in there.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're all very comfortable with work from home. I think it's probably becoming more efficient. I don't know what everyone else feels, but Shobit, very quickly to you, maybe we can just wrap up.
No, I was just going to, before I wrap up, I really just wanted to point one thing. We spoke about office versus resi platforms. I think one thing that differentiates the two is the efficiency of capital, right? In offices, because it's rental yielding assets, right? The way you can deploy, especially dollar-denominated money, coming in and going out is much easier vis-a-vis resi, wherein you are getting return out of sales. So it's like a self-liquidating asset. But for what I'm hearing from some of the new investors is they're going to try and play the single family home type assets even in India. And very soon hear some announcements from big boys. They'll start playing resi for lease only, not for sale. So you'll build residential condos only to rent it out and not actually to sell it. So that's a new emerging trend that will come out post-COVID. Obviously yields are not going to be as good as office, but Ritesh mentioned
Sorry,
2.5.
Shobit, just before before you conclude, I'm sorry, there's so many people who are. So there's one question from Conrad Conrad Wagner that I really have to ask. I think how do people look at smart city considering the push of the government? Is it really just in air, or do you see that?
I think Vipul can take this question quite well. Vipul, you are in the thick of things with government.
I think I'll just say that it is on the realm of the larger announcements. It's in the realm of the larger announcements that the government has made so far. Smart City has worked more on the services side. I don't think there is any large scale acquisition of land or something that has happened. So I'm not so sure it has given the kind of results that was probably with which it probably started 7 years back.
just come in. I would
Yes.
much rather live in a dump city as long as it has hospitals and doctors and education and basic urban infrastructure. I think all the other paraphernalia of a smart city citizens can manage on their own. Private sector can manage it for them. I think the government needs to just focus on giving us the basic infrastructure that we so badly need. All this, the mumbo jumbo of smart cities and all these missions and so on and so forth, I think is, absolutely nothing really making any difference on the ground so far, at least.
Uh, in fact, just to sort of simplify this, we were earlier talking about 7 cities when we were talking about foreign investors coming and putting the money. Today, we are left with 5. So Calcutta really has fallen off, and similarly, Chennai is losing its sheen. So really, we are talking about just 5 cities where all these dollars are going in, and forget about building new cities. So I think that's a distant dream, and it's not close to reality.
Just sorry, but just 2 points I want to mention here. One, we even in these times we are in active discussion with 2 investors who are now saying that we want to go beyond the top 7, but only horizontal developments, smaller projects, residential, and housing below 75 lakh rupees. That's one. Number two, you talked about rental yield in housing. There's one category that we are right in the middle of doing, which is we have been working on for the same time, but it got accentuated with this COVID, which is industrial housing. A lot of industrial players are coming and saying, listen, if we want to get these people back and this aspect also, we need to give them a good workplace, but you need to give them also a decent home.
So labor camps. One
Labor
version.
camp is it's a degenerated, wrong,
One.
probably a wrong word, but it is working hostels, not working hostels, but dorms and 1 BHKs for the working class, because not everybody is working there is a construction worker, especially in industrial units. So these two categories are also coming up in a big way. You'll see a lot of interest and announcements, especially in the former, which is city number 7 to city number 15.
Yeah.
Hey, I
Agree.
think Ritesh, people are loving your, smart city without infra versus dumb city with infra. So I think you coined a phrase which is getting a lot of attraction here in comment section. Okay, great. Shobit, your closing
So,
marks, please.
so thank you guys. Thank you all the participants for being there, listening to us. Thank you, Nishit Desai, for organizing. Vipul, Ritesh, Abhinav, and of course Richard for doing this. I think the few takeaways that I have is you're saying equity on Resi will increase, new formats will come in, underwriting is going to change, and there's going to be less dependence on customer sales, is the point that Ritesh made, uh, and and likely that it will come at some additional pace than usual. I mean, we may not be neck to neck with Office, but I think Office platforms are there, Resi platforms are there to sort of compete going forward. And of course, corporate governance will be at all-time high. I don't think mistakes that were made in 2005 to 2012 are going to be repeated. Maybe we'll all make new mistakes. With that, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists and Ruchir and Nishit Desai once again.